Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. My guest today, Andrei Grachev, was on holiday at his country house near Moscow on the day in August 1991 when his mother phoned him to tell him that his boss, Mikhail Gorbachev, had been arrested in Crimea. Now, on state television, the classical Russian ballet Swan Lake was interrupted with news that Gorbachev had fallen ill and could no longer exercise his functions as Soviet leader. A 7-man emergency committee assumed power. Now, we all know the rest. The putsch crumbled. Gorbachev would resign a few months later, Christmas Day 1991, consigning a 74-year-old experiment known as the USSR to history's dustbin. And my guest, Andrei Grachev, Gorbachev's now former spokesman and advisor, would go on to become a leading specialist in international relations and the author of several books on the demise of the Soviet Union and the rise of a new Russia. Welcome to our studios.
Hello.
I want to ask you, Gorbachev was, by anyone's estimation, a transformative figure. He took down the Berlin Wall. He pulled Soviet troops out of Afghanistan and Eastern Europe, as you observe. He ended the Cold War. Some people would look at Russia today and say Vladimir Putin is doing exactly the reverse. Do you agree?
Well, Vladimir Putin is certainly in many aspects a regression vis-à-vis the time of Gorbachev and especially the hopes of perestroika. While at the same time you have to be prudent and careful in definitions because, you know, the amount of change that has been introduced and even imposed by Gorbachev's what I call a preventive or preemptive revolution was so huge, so important, that maybe the society, the traditional Soviet at that time society, was in need of some time and perhaps the time of a generation to digest it, to absorb it, and to make it, its own experience. And that's why I call, for example, the Gorbachev revolution as a kind of, a revolution of leaders, or let's say of a generation of the...
A younger generation.
Yeah, of the children of the 20th Congress, the Congress of de-Stalinization or denunciation of the system, certainly, but above all of Stalin's crimes. The revolution of that generation of the last Westerners inside the Soviet society, while that revolution was not followed by what you should call the infantry.
Right,
the mass of the society that was not at that time convinced in the absolute necessity of the change.
But that said, listen, I lived in Russia at the time. I remember my major memory was optimism everywhere. There was this sense of new opportunity and possibility. And you obviously felt that too. Do you feel that today in Russia? It seems more cynical, the atmosphere.
Yeah, you're right. The problem is that the explanation of this phenomena should be more complex than just the, let's say, the nostalgia for the great power or for the past glory of the great Soviet Union, one of the, or perhaps the first winner of the Second World War and the man who launched Gagarin in the space. The explanation should be not only the unfortunate experience, the daily experience that lived millions of people having discovered that every change has a price tag attached to it. And they had to pay that price, not the West, who could just profit from the end of the Cold War and from the end of the Iron Curtain and the division of Europe. But it were the Russians, the Soviets at that time,
who paid the price,
who had to pay the price, above all, for the destruction of the former economy, the centralized economy, the Gosplan economy. But another aspect of the deception comes from the fact that they have discovered that Western reality, which previously had been idealized because presented as something like a dream, like an objective to imitate, to catch up with, or to rebuild inside Russia.
Inside Russia. So there has been a backlash, in a sense, a little bit against the West. The West perhaps was too triumphant in its attitude?
The West was triumphant. It was also negligent and I would say arrogant in its relationship with the post-Soviet Russia. That was believing that at least it deserved, due to the fact that it found in itself, inside the society, the democratic potential to free itself from the former oppressive system. But on the other hand, it wasn't met with the necessary or expected hospitality. The common European home of which Gorbachev was dreaming, in fact, was built but without Russia, Russia being pushed aside. And to sum it up, I would say that globally, the Western policy towards Russia, especially the American policy towards the Russian, was the continuation of the policy of containment rather than the policy of association in the common construction, let's say, of the answers to the new reality of the 21st century.
When we look at Ukraine right now and the policies there, the West has presented it as Vladimir Putin being very aggressive, belligerent, not respecting any of the rules of the post-war international order. How would you frame his actions in Ukraine? Is he just defending the interests of Russia?
The paradox of Putin's behavior in Ukraine, first, let's be clear about Putin. I wouldn't call him an ideologist or, let's say, a man with a particular nostalgia for imperial grandeur, greatness of.
But wait, can I just interrupt you? He did call the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century.
At the same time, he was saying that it would be, it would be, let's say, fruitless or impossible to have the ambition to rebuild the Soviet Union. Curiously, I would rather compare Putin's action in Ukraine to Brezhnev's action in Czechoslovakia, in the sense that was given with the definition of de Gaulle, which was already a paradox, because he qualified this action as a defensive action.
And he actually, and Brezhnev said that he was invited in by the
in a way, because
Czechs.
the defensive in the sense that he was trying to protect and to secure his system. And from this point of view, Ukraine for Putin is another threat, already a political threat, back at home, with its example, with maybe, I would say, a temptation that could be provoked within the Russian society to follow the example of Ukraine. And another aspect in this defensive action is, maybe it can be called as a paranoiacal vision, maybe it can be called as a vision of the former KGB officer, but at the same time, Putin maybe partially is right when he observes the West expanding in the direction of Russian borders, with NATO, and bringing inside the structure the former parts of the Soviet empire, but even of the Soviet republics. And from this point of view, even the recent war of Russia against Georgia was a signal that has been sent by Putin, announcing that there are certain red lines that the Russian power in the Kremlin wouldn't allow the West to cross.
You still speak to Mikhail Gorbachev. Today, he is not a popular man in Russia. What does he say to you about what he sees now, the current situation? What does he say to you about Vladimir Putin?
Well, he is not on good terms with Vladimir Putin, and that can be easily explained with all the, let's say, analysis we've given, because Putin's Russia is certainly very different from the vision that Gorbachev was trying, I would say, to invest in the change that he was introducing in this. Yes. First, from the point of view of internal development, which is a return to a much more traditional authoritarian type of relationship between a monopoly power at the top and the society that is obliged to follow. But on the other hand, from the point of view of relationship of Russia and the world, and from this point of view, Gorbachev should be very much upset by this, let's say, new Eurasian image that Putin is trying to give to Russia as if Russia is turning aside from
Turning its back.
traditional
Yeah.
orientation to become a European country, which has been, well, the ambition of many Russian leaders since Peter the Great.
Since Peter the Great. Andrei Grachev, we have less than a minute. Briefly, does Mikhail Gorbachev have any regrets? If he had to do it again, one big thing he would do differently?
Well, he would have avoided maybe the coup in August 91, I would say not forever, but at least to gain some more time to allow and to gain additional time for his project of reform. And second thing, maybe he would have sent Boris Yeltsin to the post of ambassador.
We all know what happened with history in that case. Andrei Grachev, thank you so much. You're a former spokesman and a former advisor for Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. You're also, and we haven't spoken about, an author of a new book called, in French for now, Russia's Past is Unpredictable, I guess. Maybe it will be translated to English at some point.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for sharing some of your views, Russia then and Russia now, here on The Interview. And thanks to all of you for watching. More news just ahead on France 24.